Okay, hi. My name's Susan Elliot-Wright, and I'm very pleased to be interviewing Russ Thomas for the Derby Book Festival, talking about his novel Firewatching, which came out in February, I think, didn't it, Russ?
Yes, seems a long time ago. Yeah, February.
Feels like a long time ago now.
Yeah, as time flies, but yeah, February it came out.
So just to start off then, could you tell us a little bit about where you got the idea for Firewatching from?
Yeah, it started life, perhaps unusually for a novel, I'm not sure, as a short story. And I'd written this short story many, many years ago about an elderly woman who was coming sort of towards the end of her life and suffering from some form of dementia. And she is in a care home, essentially waiting for visitors who never arrive. And that was the basis of the story. And throughout the story, you got little hints of her life and where she'd come from and how she got to where she was. And this idea sort of stayed with me. And then I started an MA at Sheffield University a long time ago, it feels like now. And I dug it out to make a start on some work for my piece that I had to write. At that time, you had to write a whole novel and this story had stuck with me, so I dug it out, gave it another go, and it kind of grew from there. And a few other characters were introduced, and I wanted to explore this woman's life and how she'd got to where she was. And then my tutor at the time, when I took in the amount of 10,000 words, I think it was, we had to give to her, and my tutor at the time, Leslie Glaister, said to me, oh, it's really, really good. I love your characters and your writing's fantastic. The only issue is, where's the plot? And
you need one of those, don't you?
Oh, yeah, you definitely need one of those. So she said, well, you need to go away and think about that. So I did. And I thought, I know what I'll do. I'll throw a body in, because I obviously read a lot of crime fiction when I was younger and still do. And I thought, well, that makes for an instant plot, doesn't it? Well, there'll be a body dug up next door to this old lady, and we can see how it got there. So that's how the crime novel was born.
It was born from a story about an old lady.
Yeah, completely accidentally.
So your main character then is DS Adam Tyler. Obviously, he's the central character. He's the guy we follow all the way through. How did his character form? Did he just jump into your head fully formed and said, here I am, Adam Tyler?
Yeah, that would have been nice. No, it wasn't like that at all. He was a real struggle for me. By that point, I mean, I had a main character who was essentially doing his job in the book, in fact, investigating this crime. But then I began to realise it was going to be a crime novel, and I needed him to be a police officer. And I didn't really know much about policing, other than what I'd seen on Waking the Dead and all those other things that you watch on TV. So it took me a long time to get his character right, and he went through several name changes and several personality changes. And I realised at some point, it took many, many redrafts, changing the tense of the book, changing all sorts of things. And I realised at some point that the problem was I was trying to make him too nice. And I'd kind of made him likeable. And, well, I'd gone out of my way to make him likeable. And that just isn't what people want from fiction, I don't think. I mean, you have to sympathise, you have to enjoy your main character, but you want them to challenge you a bit and sort of do things that maybe you don't expect them to do. Yeah, it took me, once I got that down, and I changed his name again, and he kind of emerged then, fully formed on the page, almost as though he'd been waiting in the wings and then just jumped out at me. And from that point, yeah, it felt...
It's much more of an evolution than people tend to think. They think, oh, you've got this character and you're going to put him in a novel, but it's
exactly. And like a lot of things in writing, it's a long time evolving. You don't even realise it's evolving. You just think, oh, I'm not getting anywhere, I'm not getting anywhere. And then suddenly it comes to you. I think it isn't sudden. I think it's going on there somewhere in the back of your head all the way, isn't it? So, as you well know.
As I well know, yeah. So Firewatching is set here in Sheffield, and there's a very, very strong sense of place in the novel. It's sort of set in Sheffield on the borders of Derbyshire and the Peak District. That comes across really strongly. So how important is that to you as a writer to get that sense of place in your work?
Yeah, I think it's really important. It's important in any novel, but perhaps especially if you're going to write what turns out to be a police procedural series that will be constantly set in that place and hopefully evolve. So it was important the setting was right. I did play around with some other places, but I settled on Sheffield because I felt it was a little bit untapped, not a place people know particularly well, or what they do know about it is probably because of what it used to be famous for rather than what it's known for now, the steel industry. So I thought that was fun to explore and to present on the page. And obviously it's a great location because you can get to lots of other places from it quite easily. As you say, you're not far from the Peak District, and although technically it's part of the action of the novel, as you know, happens in the Peak District, and someone pointed out to me from a very early point that my protagonist wouldn't be able to work there because he works for South Yorkshire Police, not Derbyshire Police. So I had to invent a village that is called Castledene, which is right on the very edge of the Peak District, just kind of the last village before you get over the border into Derbyshire. So that got me out of that problem.
That makes it South Yorkshire Police's area to deal with.
Yeah, exactly. So yeah, it was important, and it remains important when I'm writing to try and put as much of the city in it as possible, but also the surroundings and the surrounding areas. Yeah, I think people like that, particularly perhaps of crime novels and getting
I think you're right, and I think the sense of place, it helps the reader sort of locate themselves in the story as well anyway, doesn't it?
Sure. Yeah.
I think we've got a little secret about Castledene, haven't we? Because
yeah, are we allowed?
You invented Castledene. Totally sounds like a Peak District village. And at the time when your novel was being born, mine was being conceived, and I asked your permission first, didn't I?
Yeah, you did.
I nicked Castledene, so we actually both have Castledene in our novels. So we think people will start to come to the Peak District and try and find Castledene village.
If anyone wants to find out more about Castledene and they can't, and they haven't had enough from reading Firewatching, where can they find out more?
They can find out more in The Flight of Cornelia Blackwood.
Ah, very good, very good.
Which I'll mention again at the end briefly. Thanks for the plug. Now, you mentioned, you said at the start that this whole novel actually arose from your short story about a little old lady. That's actually still a very, very strong plot line in Firewatching, isn't it? And in fact, there's two old ladies, Lily and Edna. Can you just tell us a little bit more about Lily and Edna? Yeah,
they're based very loosely on two elderly aunts I had when I was a child, and who helped kind of drag me up. And I spent a lot of time in the company of old ladies when I was young. Perhaps where I got some of my love of reading from, I don't know. I certainly read widely, and they certainly, but as well as my parents, kind of were always pushing books on me. The real ladies they're based on, one of them was bombed out of London during the war and moved in. I grew up in Ascot in Berkshire, and they moved in together back in the 40s, early 1940s, and had lived together ever since. And there was always this unresolved question in my mind exactly what their relationship was and how it worked. So I wanted to explore that a bit. I also love older voices in fiction. I think it, but not just older voices, but a mix of voices. So I wanted there to be a voice in the book that wasn't just a police officer investigating a crime, but also somebody who was the victim of a crime and was living with the consequences of that. And so, yeah, that's where they can kind of evolved from.
And I think they make a great other voice, don't they, in the novel? I think it's quite unusual to have that with the old lady voice as well as your main police officer.
Hopefully.
How much research did you have to do for this? Because it comes across as being very well researched.
I've got away with it. Yeah, I did a lot. Yeah, it's obviously a lot easier now than it used to be with the internet. You can look anything up you want anytime. Obviously, you have to keep in mind the providence of that and whether that information is correct or not. But yeah, so I did a lot of research into fires because there's obviously, given the title, it's no surprise to note that there's a heavy dose of fire in the book, and so I did a lot of research into arson and into fires that happened in history, and I also did, obviously the other side of that was the police research, because it's important that you get that right. You then have to deliberately get it wrong, because you can't have a novel read exactly the way a police crime would be investigated. It would be far too boring. So you have to make allowances and change things. And it's not 100% the way the police would do things. But I wanted it to feel as if it was, and to feel as real as possible. So I spoke to a retired chief superintendent. Apologies, that's my computer beeping. I spoke to a retired chief superintendent who was really, really helpful, and also a young police constable who was a friend of a friend, and she was brilliant in telling me that kind of everyday stuff about how the police go about their work. And it's all a lot more prosaic than you might imagine, but I actually find that quite interesting. Quite fun.
Sorry.
No, go ahead.
No, I was just to say, it's certainly, it comes across well in the novel. It all feels very, very real, very believable, and you know, that we totally get absorbed in their day-to-day working.
Thank you.
So I wanted to ask you a bit more about your police characters, because obviously we've got D.S. Tyler, but there are, you know, the other police officers in the department. One of the officers I particularly liked was Constable Rabani. Now she's a bit of an outlier, really, in this department, isn't she? Because she's young, she's a woman, she's a Muslim, she's just sort of an unexpected character, and Tyler forms quite a close relationship with her. What was the idea behind her character? Where did she spring from?
She was kind of the opposite to Tyler. She came out of nowhere. I wasn't expecting her, and then she started to take over. So whereas I'd fought to find his character, we should probably say a bit about him. He's a bit of a lone wolf. He doesn't get on well with people. He doesn't make friends easily, and he's not too popular with most of his colleagues. So I wanted somebody to kind of rub up against that. And I certainly wanted her to be a woman, because I felt that would address some balance, and you know, he has a male perspective, so I wanted her to have a female one. She kind of just appeared on the page. Her sort of background was there. I didn't deliberately decide to put a Southeast Asia or a South Asian character in, but you know, it seemed to fit, and then it seemed to fit that she was Muslim, and it kind of, she just kind of turned up. All of that stuff makes for quite interesting reason. The reason for inventing her really was to give another point of view, so that we could see perhaps the same things that Tyler sees, but from a slightly different perspective. So because he has quite a very rigid one way of looking at the world, I wanted it to present the facts, much as they are, from a different perspective, and someone who perhaps is a bit younger, got different things to prove, although they both have a lot to prove. And yeah, they work quite well, and that was a happy accident. I didn't realise that I was forming almost a double act as the book went on.
You've got to have a double act in a piece. So I wanted to ask you a bit about the structure of the novel, because it's very cleverly structured. You've got this, the main action taking place over 7 days. And each of those 7 sections starts with a blog post, which is by this elusive and mysterious figure called the Firewatcher. How did you come up with that?
Again, it was kind of more by accident than design. It started really as a device because I wanted to explore these famous fires from history. So each blog post sort of identifies a famous fire from the past and explores that. But it suddenly became quite an important strand to the plot, and actually the thing that the whole book is structured around, really. The blog posts go out each day, pretty much throughout the book, and then you get the corresponding action taking place. So it's a bit difficult to talk about it without giving too much away, but again, it was one of those happy accidents born through years and years of hard work writing and evolving. So what started as, in the very early drafts, they were poems rather than blog posts. And then I realised I can't write poetry for love nor money. So I had to change them. And blog posts seemed a bit more modern and of the moment. So yeah, and it also gives me a chance. On each of the posts, there are comments from people who are reading them on the internet, which range from the sublime to the ridiculous. And so that was a little way of commenting on the internet in society and social media and that kind of love-hate relationship we all have with it. So it was another element that I could put in.
And another very realistic element, I think. So just going away from the actual novel for a minute, before this is your first novel, before it was published, you did a number of other jobs, like a lot of aspiring writers do, to pay bills. Can you tell us a bit about what you did and whether any of those things you think influenced your development as a writer?
Yeah, I did all sorts of things, restaurant work, shop work, and whatever it took to make ends meet. I worked as a Thorpe Park ranger at one point, dressing up as Mr. Bear and entertaining the kids. That was fun. It was fun. It was great. I've worked as a storage salesman. I'm not sure any of them particularly fed into my work, other than the way in which all human life feeds into your work, I suppose. But for most of my life, I was a bookseller, and that certainly did influence what I wanted to do. Well, I went into bookselling because I knew I wanted to be a writer, and it felt like a way I could at least be around books until I could make that happen. So I always very much wanted to be a writer. I'm not one of those people that it came too late in life. I've wanted this since I was 4 years old or 5 or whatever age I was. Yeah, so it kind of, I remember briefly, my mum reminded me recently actually of a conversation we'd had when I was younger, where she tried to convince me to go into journalism because she felt that was probably going to make me more money, or certainly be more stable. And I said to her, no, Mum, I don't want to be a journalist because I don't want to write about dead bodies all the time. So I'd forgotten this, but she reminded me, that assures me that this was a conversation that we had. And it turns out that's what I've ended up doing anyway.
Oh, the irony. Before we just talk about the series and about the next book, I'd wonder if you just want to give us a quick flavour of what your writing process is. What's your writing day? Do you sit there at 8 o'clock in the morning and write non-stop until 7 o'clock at night? Or
you're just asking me because you know full well that's not what I do. No, I wish I was that good, but I'm not. I tend to, when it's going well, I tend to get up early and try and write first thing, because I tend to do my best work first thing in the morning. The afternoon I'd save for research or for admin tasks and things like that. So that's kind of roughly the structure of the day. I very rarely work into the evening, except for when I'm in the editing process, which I'm doing now for the second book, and I at that stage, I do tend to sit there from morning through till night, and that's the bit I really enjoy. The going through, once the words are down on the page, going through them, honing them into something better. And I can sit there for hours on end sometimes and forget to eat and forget to.
I'm the same. I love
my
that
legs.
bit. That's a good bit.
Yeah.
So just sort of wrapping up. The Tyler, we sort of learned through Firewatching that Tyler has quite a complicated history, and we get little hints of things that will come to light. So this is a two-part question, really. So, did you know when you started this book that this was going to be the start of a series?
Yes. Well, I suppose I didn't immediately. I started the book because I didn't even know I was writing a crime novel at that point. Once I did, it became quite clear that Tyler's backstory and who he is and his character there was more to that than I could explain in one novel. So I very much decided from quite early on that there was going to be a second and potentially a third. So yeah.
And you're working on the second now. I think I understand that you're sort of almost wrapping that up now.
Yeah, I've interrupted the very final edits for this interview. So yeah, I should be going back. I'll say go back to my desk, still sitting at my desk later to try and finish that off. And that will be going off to the publisher at the end of this week. So yeah.
Is there anything that you can tell us about the next book without giving too much away? But
okay. Yeah, so the second one's called Night Hawking, keeping the theme going of long book titles with ing on the end. Night Hawking, which is the illegal practice of metal detectoring on private land. So people who go out with metal detectors and dig up treasures on private land and then sell them on for profit. And this happens quite a lot in archaeological digs, all sorts of places. So the book opens with somebody out with a metal detector late at night who gets a reading and digs up more than he bargained for. And so I'll perhaps leave it there.
That sounds like a great start to a novel. Digs up more than he bargained for. So okay, just like to say thank you for the interview, Russ. I think you've given us a lot to think about with Firewatching, which is, if I can get it at the camera, can we see it? Can you see Firewatching? So this is Firewatching. It's out now. It's great. Read it. It's really good. Next month, Night Hawking coming next year. And if anyone's interested in my book, it's The Flight of Cornelia Blackwood. Mirror writing there, so that's mine as well. So, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.